Imagine a world where everything we know about ancient civilizations, the rise and fall of empires, the lives of legendary figures, the very roots of our culture, rests on a handful of fragile, often conflicting sources. What if those sources were shaped by bias, distorted by time, or crafted to serve someone's agenda? For centuries, that's exactly the challenge historians have faced, and it's in the fiery debates, the rivalries, and the relentless questioning among scholars that our understanding of antiquity has been forged, broken apart, and rebuilt again and again. This isn't just about dusty books and academic arguments. It's a high-stakes human drama where competing interpretations have reshaped history itself, turning what we thought was certain into something alive, evolving, and endlessly fascinating. Think about the stories you learned in school: the glory of Rome, the mysteries of Egypt, the wisdom of Greece. Many of those narratives were built on foundations that later historians exposed as incomplete, idealized, or outright misleading. It's through the clashes between experts, each armed with fragments of evidence and driven by different perspectives, that we've come to see the ancient world in richer, more nuanced ways. These intellectual battlegrounds have given us startling revisions: empires that fell not from moral decay but from economic collapse, heroes who were as flawed as they were brilliant, and civilizations whose true stories were buried under layers of myth and propaganda. This ongoing conversation isn't just about correcting the record, it's about understanding how history is made, who gets to tell it, and why it matters to all of us today. In this video, we're diving deep into how competing historians have changed what we know about the ancients, unraveling the controversies, the breakthroughs, and the personal rivalries that have rewritten the past. From the heated debates over the fall of Rome to the passionate arguments about the real Jesus, from the decipherment of long-lost scripts to the reevaluation of women's roles in antiquity, we'll explore the moments where history turned on a single discovery or a bold new interpretation. You'll see how these conflicts aren't just academic exercises. They reflect our deepest questions about power, identity, and truth. So join me on this journey into the heart of historical inquiry, where every fact is up for grabs and every answer leads to new questions, and where the past is never quite as settled as it seems. Think about the most challenging puzzle you've ever faced, and then imagine that most of the pieces are missing, some are faded beyond recognition, and a few were deliberately created to mislead you. This is the daily reality for historians trying to understand the ancient world. Their evidence isn't found in neat, controlled laboratories, but in the fragile, fragmented, and often contradictory remnants of the past. We're talking about papyrus scrolls crumbling to dust at the slightest touch, stone inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, and fragile artifacts that have survived more by accident than design. Each piece is a precious clue, but it's never the full story. Unlike a chemist who can run the same experiment over and over, a historian gets only one chance to interpret a unique, often damaged piece of evidence. And the sources themselves are rarely straightforward. An ancient king's chronicle wasn't written for a future textbook. It was carved into a palace wall to boast of his victories, intimidate his rivals, and please his gods. A Roman emperor's biography might have been commissioned by his political successor to legitimize his own rule, meaning flattery and omission were standard practice. Even a seemingly simple receipt on a clay tablet only tells us about one transaction in one place, leaving us to guess at the vast economic system it was part of. This means every document comes with a hidden layer of bias, purpose, and perspective that historians must painstakingly peel back. This inherent uncertainty is what turns historical study into such a dynamic and at times contentious field. Because the evidence is so open to interpretation, two brilliant scholars can look at the exact same crumbling papyrus or excavated foundation and construct two entirely different, yet equally plausible, narratives about what happened. One might see a grand economic collapse behind a change in pottery styles, while another argues for a gradual cultural shift. This isn't a weakness in the discipline, it's its greatest strength. This ambiguity fuels a healthy competition of ideas, forcing historians to constantly question, re-evaluate, and refine their theories against new discoveries and the critiques of their peers. The goal isn't to find a single, unassailable truth, but to build the most convincing and well-supported story from the scattered clues we have, always knowing that the next discovery could change everything. Now consider the very first historians, the pioneers who set out to record the human story. They weren't neutral observers with perfect information. They were storytellers, citizens, and thinkers deeply embedded in their own worlds. Take Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the man celebrated as the father of history. His monumental work, the Histories, was a sprawling inquiry into the Greco-Persian Wars, but it was so much more than a simple timeline of battles. Herodotus traveled widely, collecting stories from Egyptians, Persians, and countless others, weaving together first-hand accounts, local myths, and his own observations. He would often present multiple versions of an event, sometimes labeling a particularly fantastical tale as something he'd heard, but couldn't necessarily verify. This approach gives us a rich tapestry of the ancient Mediterranean worldview, but it also means his history is a blend of fact, folklore, and rumor, all filtered through his Greek perspective, which naturally saw the Persian Empire as a vast, despotic other to be contrasted with Greek freedom. Then there's his successor, Thucydides, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War with a methodology that feels much more modern to our ears. He explicitly criticized his predecessors for prioritizing a good story over the hard truth, and he vowed to stick to factual, eyewitness accounts of events he himself had lived through. He sought underlying causes and universal patterns of human behavior, believing his work would be a possession for all time. Yet, for all his scientific rigor, Thucydides was not free from bias. He was an Athenian general, and his narrative, while often critically examining Athenian strategy, is still told from an Athenian viewpoint. His portrayal of Athenian democracy is complex, but his characterization of Spartan society or the motivations of Athenian allies can be strikingly one-dimensional. He elevates rational, political explanations for events, sometimes at the expense of cultural or religious factors that were undoubtedly important to the people living them. His history is a masterwork, but it is a masterwork with a distinct point of view. These two foundational figures established a pattern that would define historiography for millennia. They demonstrated that the writing of history is never a simple act of transcription. It is an act of interpretation, selection, and construction. Every historian, no matter how objective they aim to be, must choose which events to include, which voices to amplify, and which narrative framework to use. Herodotus and Thucydides made these choices based on their cultural environment, their political loyalties, and their personal intellectual projects. Herodotus wanted to explain the incredible conflict between Greece and Persia by exploring the entire known world, while Thucydides wanted to extract timeless lessons about power, fear, and human nature from a brutal civil war. Their agendas shaped their histories as much as the events themselves. This inherent subjectivity embedded in the very origins of historical writing is precisely why later scholars have been locked in a constant process of revision. We can't simply take these ancient texts at face value as pure, unvarnished truth. Instead, historians must become detectives, reading between the lines to understand the author's biases, cross-referencing accounts with archaeological evidence, and constantly asking, why did they choose to tell the story this way? The work of Herodotus and Thucydides isn't valuable despite their biases. It's invaluable because of them. Their perspectives offer us a window into how the ancient Greeks saw themselves and their world. The competition between their different approaches, the inclusive storyteller versus the analytical realist, set the stage for every historical debate that followed, proving that the quest to understand the past has always been a conversation and often an argument between competing truths. As the classical world receded, the task of recording history didn't vanish. It simply moved from the secular forum into the quiet, candlelit scriptoriums of medieval monasteries. Here, history was no longer written for the glory of the state, but for the glory of God and the specific religious order that employed the scribe. These monastic chroniclers saw themselves not as neutral observers, but as pious men interpreting divine will through human events. Their accounts were deeply shaped by a potent mix of unwavering religious dogma, fierce regional pride, and intense competition between different monastic houses for influence, patronage, and prestige. A chronicle from a Benedictine abbey in England might portray events in a light that subtly favored the Benedictines over the newer Franciscan or Dominican orders, while a French monastery's history would naturally champion its local saints and patrons over those from a rival region. This wasn't considered dishonest. It was seen as upholding a sacred truth as they understood it. Consider two of the most famous works from this era: the Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People and the multi-authored Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Bede, a monk in Northumbria, produced a work of staggering scholarship for its time, meticulously constructing a narrative of how the English people came to be unified under Roman Christianity. His history is a powerful, cohesive story of divine providence and spiritual progress. Yet, it's also a story told from a specific angle. It emphasizes the role of the Roman Church and his own Northumbrian kingdom, sometimes at the expense of the Celtic Christian traditions or other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. He was writing with a purpose: to celebrate the triumph of his brand of Christianity and to cement the spiritual authority of his own monastery and its allies. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, by contrast, is not a single narrative but a collection of annals maintained in different monasteries across England for centuries. If you compare the entries from a monastery in Winchester with those from one in Peterborough for the same year, you might find startling differences. The Winchester version might highlight the deeds of a king who was a generous patron to their abbey, while the Peterborough scribe, perhaps slighted by the same king, might downplay his successes or emphasize his failures. A military victory could be described as a glorious triumph in one chronicle and a bloody, costly affair in another, depending on which side the monastery's abbot had supported. These weren't mere differences of opinion. They were reflections of how deeply a monastery's worldly fortunes, its land holdings, its wealth, its political protection were tied to the historical narrative it propagated. The stakes of these written rivalries were incredibly high, far beyond any modern academic debate. A chronicle that successfully documented a monastery's ancient land grants, backed by a story of a pious king's donation, could be the difference between keeping that land or losing it to a rival noble or a competing bishop in a legal dispute. A hagiography that effectively promoted the local saint associated with a particular abbey could attract a flood of pilgrims, donations, and royal favor, elevating that abbey's status and spiritual authority above its neighbors. History was a form of currency, a tool for building institutional power and ensuring survival in a volatile world. It reminds us that the famous adage about history being written by the winners isn't just about battles. It's often about which institution could produce, preserve, and promote the most compelling version of the past. Yet, the fascinating paradox of this period is that the very nature of this decentralized, competitive system of record-keeping also allowed dissenting voices and alternative narratives to survive. Because there was no single, official state history, because dozens of monasteries were all keeping their own records with their own biases, a version of events that was suppressed or ignored in one place might well be preserved in another. A chronicle from a defeated faction, an account critical of a powerful king, or a record of a marginalized community could find safe harbor within the walls of a distant abbey, waiting centuries for a modern historian to discover it and integrate its contrasting perspective into a fuller, more complex tapestry of the past. The monastic rivalries that colored so much of our medieval evidence also, perhaps accidentally, ensured that no single victor could completely erase the voices of those they had defeated. Then, centuries later, a new intellectual revolution began to stir, not in monasteries but in the bustling cities of Italy. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, was a period of dazzling rediscovery, where scholars, artists, and princes suddenly looked back past the Middle Ages to the glories of ancient Greece and Rome. They scoured old libraries, paying good money for any forgotten manuscript they could find, eager to absorb the wisdom of Cicero, Plato, and Livy. But this wasn't a quiet, peaceful revival. Instead, it ignited some of the fiercest and most consequential intellectual battles Europe had ever seen. The humanist scholars at the heart of this movement weren't just passively reading these ancient texts. They were arguing fiercely over what they meant, whether they were even real, and how this rediscovered past should shape their present world. This was the birth of modern scholarship, and it was anything but polite. The most explosive example of this new, critical way of thinking came from a brilliant and argumentative scholar named Lorenzo Valla. In the 1440s, he turned his attention to a document that had been a cornerstone of papal power for over 600 years, the Donation of Constantine. This text purported to be a decree from the 4th century Emperor Constantine, granting the Pope and his successors political control over Rome and the entire Western Roman Empire. For the medieval church, this was the ultimate legal and historical justification for its vast temporal power. Valla, however, decided to treat it not as a sacred relic, but as a text to be analyzed. Using a revolutionary method called philology, the critical study of language and its historical development, he dissected the Latin of the Donation. He found words, phrases, and concepts that simply didn't exist in the 4th century. The Latin was clunky, an imitation of a style long past. It was, as Valla proved beyond a reasonable doubt, an elaborate 8th century forgery. His work didn't just win an academic argument. It was a seismic event that used historical evidence to directly challenge the authority of the Pope himself, demonstrating that scholarly debate could shake the very foundations of power and change the course of history. Beyond these dramatic exposes, the humanists were also locked in a deeper, more philosophical struggle over how to use the past. One camp, led by thinkers like Petrarch, saw ancient Rome as a golden age to be emulated and revived in every way. They believed its literature, its art, its system of government, and even its Latin prose style were perfect models to be copied slavishly. For them, history was a source of timeless ideals. But another, more critical school of thought began to emerge. Scholars like Niccolò Machiavelli and Francesco Guicciardini looked at Roman history not for idealistic inspiration, but for practical, often cynical, lessons on power, statecraft, and human nature. Machiavelli, in his Discourses on Livy, analyzed the Roman Republic not to copy it, but to understand the mechanics of its success and failure so he could apply those lessons to the chaotic politics of Renaissance Italy. This shift was monumental. It marked the move from seeing history as a repository of perfect examples to seeing it as a complex laboratory of human experience, full of both brilliant successes and cautionary tales that needed to be studied critically, not merely worshipped. These fierce debates over authenticity, translation, and interpretation forged the tools of modern historical criticism. The humanists, in their competitive quest to prove each other wrong, to uncover a more authentic text, or to champion a more compelling interpretation, developed the fundamental techniques we still use today: comparing sources, analyzing language, understanding historical context, and questioning the motives behind every document. They proved that the recovery of the past is never a simple act of finding and accepting. It is a process of interrogation, a constant and often contentious dialogue between the present and the past, where every rediscovered truth has the power to unsettle the comfortable certainties of the present and open up new possibilities for the future. If the Renaissance was about rediscovering the classical past, the Enlightenment that followed was about judging it. A new breed of thinker emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, armed not with religious faith but with a powerful new tool: reason. Philosophers and historians like Voltaire, David Hume, and most famously Edward Gibbon began to approach history not as a record of divine will or a collection of moral tales, but as a vast human laboratory. They sought to explain the rise and fall of civilizations through secular causes: politics, economics, social structures, and human nature itself. This was a radical shift. For the first time on such a scale, history was being systematically separated from theology, and the resulting clash of worldviews would reverberate through academia and society for centuries. No single work captures this intellectual earthquake better than Edward Gibbon's monumental 6-volume masterpiece, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Published between 1776 and 1788, it was a staggering achievement of narrative sweep and scholarly detail. But what made it truly revolutionary and truly controversial was its central argument. Gibbon, applying his cool, rationalist, and often deeply ironic analysis, pointed to two primary causes for Rome's collapse: internal decay and the rise of Christianity. He argued that the passive virtues promoted by Christianity, humility, piety, a focus on the afterlife, eroded the public-spirited, martial courage that had built the Republic. He described the early church fathers not as saints but as fanatics, and the spread of the faith as a destructive force that diverted resources, fragmented civic unity, and encouraged Romans to abandon their earthly duties. To a society where religious authority was still deeply interwoven with political power, this was not just academic heresy, it was a direct assault on a fundamental pillar of the established order. The reaction was immediate and furious. Gibbon was denounced from pulpits and in pamphlets across Europe. Religious scholars mounted a fierce counteroffensive, defending the church and attacking what they saw as Gibbon's biased use of sources and his sneering, dismissive tone. They argued that far from causing the fall, Christianity had actually helped preserve order and culture amidst the chaos, offering a new moral framework as the old one crumbled. This debate was about far more than just the facts of Rome's fall. It was a proxy war for the soul of the Enlightenment itself. On one side were those like Gibbon and Voltaire, who championed a vision of history driven by human reason, secular progress, and natural causes. They saw the past as a story of human achievement and folly, from which modern society could learn to build a more rational, enlightened future. Arrayed against them were scholars and clerics who maintained a worldview centered on divine providence. For them, history was not a random sequence of events but a grand narrative directed by God's hand, a moral drama where virtue was rewarded and sin was punished. From this perspective, Rome fell not because of economic inflation or military overstretch, but because of moral corruption and a turning away from traditional values. This wasn't merely an academic disagreement. It was a fundamental collision between two incompatible ways of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. The Enlightenment historians, through their provocative reinterpretations, forced a public conversation about whether human affairs were governed by faith or by reason, by heaven or by earth. This period perfectly illustrates a crucial truth that echoes through every historical debate. Interpretation is never isolated. It is always a product of its time, deeply entangled with the broader cultural, philosophical, and political currents swirling around the historian. Gibbon wasn't just an isolated genius in a library. He was a man of his age, influenced by the skeptical philosophy of David Hume and the biting satire of Voltaire. His work reflected the Enlightenment's growing confidence in human reason and its increasing suspicion of unchecked religious and political authority. Similarly, his critics were defending not just a religious interpretation of history, but an entire social and political order that was based upon it. The fight over the bones of the Roman Empire was in reality a fight about the future of European society. It demonstrated that every generation looks to the past and sees its own anxieties, its own hopes, and its own battles reflected back at it, and in rewriting history, they are often attempting to shape the world to come. Just as the Enlightenment debates were simmering across Europe, the 19th century ushered in a new and powerful force that would dramatically reshape the writing of history: nationalism. The map of Europe was being redrawn. Old empires were clashing with new nation-states, and a fierce, competitive pride in one's own people and their unique destiny took hold. In this charged atmosphere, history was no longer just an academic pursuit or a philosophical exercise. It became a vital tool for nation-building. Historians were suddenly tasked with a monumental new job: to craft a glorious, unified past for their people, a shared story that could inspire patriotism, justify political expansion, and prove their nation's superiority over its rivals. This wasn't about finding the truth so much as it was about creating a usable past. Perhaps no one embodies this complex duality better than the German historian Leopold von Ranke. He is often hailed as the father of modern, scientific history because he championed a revolutionary new standard. He argued that historians should rigorously critique their sources, strive for absolute objectivity, and present the past as it actually happened, free from personal bias or philosophical agenda. This was a monumental step forward in methodology. Yet, in practice, von Ranke's own work was deeply intertwined with the political project of Prussian nationalism. He served as the official historiographer of the Prussian state, and his multi-volume histories often presented the rise of Prussia and its conservative monarchy as not just a historical fact, but as the inevitable and morally righteous culmination of German destiny. He applied his scientific methods to the sources, but the story he chose to tell, one that celebrated state power and strong leadership, perfectly served the ambitions of his patrons. He proved that even the most rigorous commitment to factual accuracy could be placed in the service of a powerful national narrative. Across the border in France, historians were engaged in a similar project, but with a strikingly different flavor. In the wake of the revolution and the turmoil that followed, France was deeply divided between monarchists and republicans. Historians like Jules Michelet, a passionate republican, set out to write a history that could heal these divisions and unify the French people under the banner of the nation. For Michelet, the true hero of history was not kings or generals, but the people. His sprawling, poetic histories portrayed France as having a unique, almost spiritual mission to spread liberty and civilization to the world. He wove a continuous thread from the Gauls to the Revolution, creating a sense of an eternal France with a democratic soul. This narrative conveniently downplayed the centuries of monarchy and internal conflict, instead inventing a tradition of popular unity that served the ideological needs of the new French Republic. Meanwhile, in Britain, as the empire reached its zenith, historians like Thomas Babington Macaulay were crafting a history that justified global domination. Macaulay's immensely popular History of England told a story of inevitable progress, in which England had uniquely evolved the perfect blend of liberty, order, and Protestant virtue. This Whig interpretation of history presented the British past as a straight, ascending line from the Magna Carta to the Glorious Revolution to the Industrial Empire, a destined journey toward greater freedom and prosperity. This narrative served as a powerful ideological weapon. It framed British imperial rule not as conquest but as a benevolent burden, the white man's burden, to bring their superior civilization and institutions to less developed peoples around the world. The ancient histories of India, Africa, and others were often dismissed as primitive or static, mere preludes to the arrival of the enlightened British. The consequences of these competing national stories were profound and often damaging to our understanding of the ancient world itself. To build a coherent national identity, historians frequently had to ignore, suppress, or explain away inconvenient evidence. German scholars searching for purely Germanic origins might downplay the deep Celtic and Slavic roots in their region. French narratives often glorified the Gauls as unified freedom fighters against Rome, overlooking the complex reality that many Gallic tribes had actually allied with the Romans. British accounts of ancient Britain sometimes marginalized the Celtic cultures of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, treating them as peripheral to the main Anglo-Saxon story of the nation. This wasn't just a matter of emphasis. It was a deliberate crafting of the past to serve the political needs of the present, creating distorted, simplified, and often racially charged views of ancient civilizations. This period stands as a powerful, and at times cautionary, reminder that history is never written in a vacuum. The fierce scholarly disputes of the 19th century, though often conducted with impeccable footnotes and newly scientific methods, were almost always reflections of much larger geopolitical conflicts. The battle between a German historian and a French historian over the legacy of Charlemagne wasn't just about medieval succession. It was a proxy war for the disputed borderlands of Alsace-Lorraine. The debate over the Aryan roots of civilizations, which began as a linguistic discussion, was tragically twisted into a racist ideology that would have catastrophic consequences in the 20th century. History had been weaponized, transformed into a means to legitimize power, rally populations, and assert cultural dominance. It shows us that when we read the histories of this era, we are not just learning about the past, we are reading the intellectual birth certificates of modern nations, documents that were carefully designed to explain not only where a people came from, but more importantly, where they believed they were destined to go. Just when it seemed the debates over ancient texts had reached a fever pitch, a whole new dimension of evidence literally burst from the ground, revolutionizing the field and igniting fresh controversies that burned even hotter. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed the spectacular rise of modern archaeology, a discipline that promised to cut through the biases of written records by offering tangible, physical proof of the past. Here at last were the actual walls of ancient cities, the tools people used, the treasures they buried, and the bones they left behind. It was a dream come true for historians, or so it seemed. In reality, these spectacular discoveries didn't settle the old arguments. They simply provided powerful new ammunition for all sides, turning dig sites into intellectual battlegrounds where scholarly wars were fought with trowels and sieves. No single figure embodies the thrilling promise and reckless perils of this new era better than the German businessman turned archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann. Driven by a lifelong, almost fanatical belief that Homer's Iliad was not myth but factual history, he set out in the 1870s to find the legendary city of Troy. Using the epic poem itself as his guide, he zeroed in on a large mound in Hisarlik in modern Turkey and began digging with a relentless, almost violent passion. His methods were, by modern standards, horrifyingly destructive. He hired hundreds of workers to carve a massive trench straight through the center of the mound, bulldozing through layer upon layer of different historical periods in his single-minded quest for Homeric glory. And then he found it, or what he declared to be it, a hoard of golden jewelry which he famously dubbed Priam's treasure after the Trojan king. The world was electrified. A businessman had succeeded where scholars had failed, seemingly proving that a story sung for millennia was rooted in truth. But the scholarly reaction was immediately and fiercely divided, a schism that continues to this day. Schliemann's supporters, then and now, hailed him as a visionary who had the courage to take Homer at his word. They pointed to the massive defensive walls he uncovered and the evidence of a catastrophic destruction layer, which they argued aligned perfectly with the legendary Trojan War. For them, this was undeniable proof that the epic poems had a historical core. His legions of critics, however, saw a very different man, a reckless treasure hunter and a sensationalist who destroyed irreplaceable archaeological context to create a dramatic story. They argued that the treasure of Priam was almost certainly from a much earlier period than any hypothetical Trojan War, and that Schliemann's romantic interpretation was a classic case of finding what you desperately want to find. The debate over Troy became a microcosm of a much larger argument. Can literature be a reliable guide to archaeology, or does physical evidence demand a more sober, scientific interpretation free from the pull of legend? This pattern of discovery, followed by intense interpretive conflict, repeated itself across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, the excavation of immense library archives in cities like Nineveh and Nippur provided a staggering wealth of cuneiform tablets. These texts contained everything from epic poetry and law codes to mundane administrative records. One might think such a treasure trove would bring consensus, but the opposite occurred. The discovery of the Sumerian king list, for example, which detailed reigns of kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years, sparked furious debates. Was this a literal record, a piece of political propaganda, or a theological text using fantastical numbers to convey the idea of a distant, mythical past? Similarly, the unearthing of Egypt's Valley of the Kings presented a stunning chronology of pharaohs, but it also created massive headaches. Scholars fiercely argued over the precise dates of reigns, the order of succession, and even the identities of certain mummies, with each new tomb discovery potentially upending the established timeline and forcing a complete rewrite of history books. The fundamental lesson from this era of great discoveries is a humbling one for anyone who seeks simple answers from the past. New evidence rarely provides a neat solution. Instead, it complicates the picture, revealing a past that is far more complex, messy, and surprising than we ever imagined. A single artifact can support multiple conflicting theories depending on how it is interpreted. A destroyed city layer could be evidence of a famous war. a regional conflict nobody wrote about, a devastating earthquake, or even an internal revolt. Archaeology gives us the pieces of the puzzle, but it doesn't provide the box top with the finished picture. That image must be painstakingly assembled by historians, and it is in that act of assembly, the choice of which pieces to connect and what story they form, that the fiercest and most fruitful debates continue to rage, ensuring our understanding of antiquity remains a living, breathing, and endlessly contested conversation. Now consider two of the most epic stories ever told, the Iliad and the Odyssey. For most of history, they were seen as the brilliant, unified masterpieces of a single, blind poet named Homer, a lone genius who composed them sometime in the 8th century BC. But in the 19th century, a simple yet profoundly disruptive question began to gnaw at scholars. How could one man in a largely illiterate society have possibly composed two such massive, complex, and perfectly structured poems? This became known as the Homeric Question, and the debate it sparked would eventually tear apart our entire understanding of these foundational texts and the shadowy era they emerged from. The fight wasn't just about one author. It was a fundamental clash over the very nature of creativity, memory, and how societies without writing preserve their past. On one side were the Unitarians. They argued passionately for the traditional view of a singular, monumental Homer. They pointed to the incredible narrative cohesion, the intricate plotting, the subtle character development, and the consistent theological themes that run through both epics. How could a chaotic, collective process, they asked, produce the tragic arc of Achilles' rage or the cunning, layered journey of Odysseus? For them, the poems were simply too sophisticated, too artistically whole, to be anything other than the product of a single, unparalleled creative mind. This Homer was a revolutionary figure, they argued, a poet who stood at the crucial crossroads between an oral culture and a newly literate one, perhaps even using the new technology of writing to compose and refine his epic visions on papyrus. Arrayed against them were the Analysts, a school of thought that grew increasingly influential. They took a scalpel to the texts, dissecting them and finding what they believed were the seams of multiple authors and multiple eras. They highlighted the famous inconsistencies. Achilles is referred to as both blonde and brunette. Characters are killed off only to reappear later with no explanation, and entire episodes seem to be awkwardly inserted digressions that disrupt the main narrative flow. For the Analysts, the Iliad and Odyssey weren't the work of one genius, but a messy patchwork, a centuries-long compilation of shorter, older folk tales and ballads that were clumsily stitched together by later editors. Their Homer was not a person, but a convenient name attached to a messy, collective tradition. Then, in the 20th century, a young American scholar named Milman Parry completely reframed the entire debate. He proposed a radical third option. What if the poems weren't the work of one man or a clumsy committee, but the stunning peak of a long, sophisticated, and highly formalized oral tradition? Parry didn't just argue his case from a library. He went into the field. He traveled to the mountains of Bosnia and Herzegovina to study a living oral epic tradition that was still practiced by Serbian guslari, bards who sang long poems of heroism and history while accompanying themselves on a one-stringed instrument called a gusle. What he discovered was revolutionary. He saw that these bards could perform for hours, improvising massive, coherent narratives on the spot. They did this by relying on a vast mental toolkit of prefabricated building blocks, standardized epithets like swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered Dawn, reusable scenes for arming warriors or describing feasts, and a whole repertoire of familiar plot structures. These formulas were the engine of oral composition, allowing the bard to fit complex ideas into the strict meter of the poetic line, while he focused on the forward momentum of the story. Parry and his colleague Albert Lord meticulously documented this process, arguing that Homer's epics were clearly built using this exact same formulaic system. The inconsistencies the analysts pointed to weren't evidence of multiple authors, but the natural byproduct of oral improvisation, the occasional reused line or slightly altered detail that a bard might insert in the heat of performance. This shift from seeing Homer as an author to understanding the poems as a crystallized moment in an oral tradition completely transformed our view of the Greek Dark Ages. Before this, the period following the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces was seen as a barren, illiterate cultural wasteland. The Homeric Question forced a dramatic reappraisal. The epics were no longer just great stories, they were a priceless, if heavily filtered, window into this lost world. The society they described, with its gift-giving chieftains, its focus on honor and glory, its complex relationship with the gods, wasn't a poetic fantasy. It was likely a preserved memory, a cultural fossil of the social structures and values of the early Iron Age, passed down and refined by generations of singers for hundreds of years before being finally set down in writing. The debate over Homer is a perfect example of how different academic disciplines can look at the same evidence and see entirely different worlds. The philologists, analyzing the text's language and structure, saw the hand of an individual artist. The anthropologists, studying living oral cultures, saw the fingerprints of a collective tradition, and the archaeologists, unearthing the ruins of Mycenaean citadels and finding artifacts that aligned with descriptions in the poems, the boar's tusk helmet, the body shield, saw a distant historical reality peeking through the layers of poetic embellishment. This controversy proves that there is no single, easy path to the past. Our understanding is built from the constant, often contentious, dialogue between these competing methods, each one illuminating a different facet of the truth and reminding us that the stories we tell about antiquity are as complex and layered as the societies that produced them. Few figures from antiquity have been pulled in so many different directions by history's interpreters as Alexander III of Macedon, a man whose short, spectacular life has been a Rorschach test for every generation that has tried to understand him. The core dilemma is stark and seemingly irreconcilable. Was he a brilliant visionary who dreamt of uniting humanity, or a blood-soaked megalomaniac whose conquests were an orgy of violence and vanity? The frustrating and fascinating truth is that the ancient sources we must rely on force us to confront both of these Alexanders simultaneously, leaving us to decide which version we find more compelling. Our main window into his world comes from biographers like Arrian and Plutarch, who wrote centuries after his death, relying on sources that were themselves often biased or lost to time. Arrian, a sober Greek historian and military man, largely based his account on the lost memoirs of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals who went on to become king of Egypt. Unsurprisingly, this source presents a largely favorable, strategic, and noble Alexander, a great commander whose actions, even the brutal ones, are given a logical military justification. Then there's Plutarch, whose approach was less about chronicling battles and more about crafting moral essays on character. His Alexander is a complex philosophical figure, a man of immense passion and potential, driven by a divine ambition to bring Greek culture and civilization to the world. But other, more critical traditions also survived, painting a picture of a paranoid tyrant who descended into drunken rages, executed his closest friends on suspicion of treason, and ordered atrocities like the crucifixion of 2,000 men from the city of Tyre and the enslavement of its women and children. The man who wept because he had no more worlds to conquer is the same man who, in a fit of rage, murdered his trusted general Cleitus the Black during a drunken argument. Which of these contradictory portraits is the real Alexander? The answer likely depends on which ancient author you're reading and, more importantly, which modern values you are using to judge him. This fundamental split in the evidence has allowed modern scholars to construct entirely different Alexanders to suit our own contemporary debates. In the 19th century, at the height of European colonialism, many British historians saw him as a civilizing hero, a precursor to their own empire, who brought order and advanced culture to the backward East. His founding of cities like Alexandria in Egypt was held up as proof of his benevolent, civilizing mission. This view saw his fusion of Greek and Persian cultures, encouraging his officers to marry Persian noblewomen, adopting elements of Persian dress and court protocol as a statesmanlike policy of enlightened unification. The 20th and 21st centuries, with their painful experiences with total war, genocide, and the bloody collapse of empires, have produced a much darker, more critical assessment. Many modern historians now emphasize the immense human cost of his campaigns. They point to the estimated hundreds of thousands of deaths, the cities razed to the ground, the population sold into slavery, and the irreversible disruption of entire cultures. From this perspective, his policy of cultural fusion looks less like enlightened statesmanship and more like a pragmatic, perhaps even cynical, strategy to control a vast, restive empire with a tiny Macedonian elite. His adoption of Persian customs can be seen as a naked grab for absolute power, an attempt to position himself as a god-king above the petty squabbles of his Macedonian companions, who eventually grew to resent his increasingly autocratic and foreign style of rule. These competing interpretations force us to ask profound questions that echo far beyond the ancient world. What is the true measure of a leader? Is it the grandeur of their vision or the human suffering required to achieve it? Can the violent imposition of one culture upon another ever lead to a positive synthesis, or is it always ultimately an act of erasure and domination? Alexander's legacy is a perfect mirror, reflecting our own deepest anxieties and aspirations about power, cultural identity, and the price of glory. We see in him what we want to see. The champion of a globalized world sees a unifier, the critic of imperialism sees a conqueror. His story, endlessly rewritten, proves that history is never a closed book. It is an ongoing argument, and the figure of Alexander the Great remains at the very center of it, forever challenging us to define what we truly value. For centuries, the collapse of the Roman Empire has stood as history's ultimate cautionary tale, a slow-motion catastrophe so vast and complex that it has become a blank canvas for every generation's deepest fears. The question of why it fell is not just an academic puzzle. It's a mirror we hold up to our own society, asking ourselves what makes a civilization resilient and what causes it to crumble from within. The debate was perhaps most famously shaped by the Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon, who in his monumental work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, pointed a sharp finger at internal moral decay and the corrosive influence of Christianity. In Gibbon's view, the robust, public-spirited virtue that built the Republic and early empire had been sapped by luxury, corruption, and a new religion that encouraged citizens to focus on the afterlife rather than their civic duties. This narrative of a great civilization succumbing to its own softness and losing its moral fiber became incredibly powerful, offering a clear and morally satisfying story of collapse that resonated deeply with his 18th century audience and continues to influence popular imagination today. Yet, as compelling as this story of moral failure can be, the vast majority of modern historians have moved decisively away from it, not because they dismiss the role of culture, but because the sheer weight of evidence points to a cascade of interconnected structural failures that would have challenged even the most virtuous society. Imagine the Roman Empire not as a noble statue decaying from a single flaw, but as a colossal, overloaded ship taking on water from a dozen different gashes at once. One of the most critical leaks was economic. The empire's economy was built on a foundation of constant expansion, fueled by plunder from new conquests and the wealth extracted from new provinces. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, the frontiers had stabilized. The easy money from conquest dried up, while the immense cost of defending thousands of miles of border against increasing pressure from Germanic tribes, Persians, and others continued to skyrocket. To pay for this massive standing army, emperors resorted to debasing the currency, melting down silver coins and mixing in cheaper metals until the Roman denarius became virtually worthless, triggering rampant inflation that shattered the economy and made it impossible for the state to pay its soldiers and officials effectively. This financial crisis was inextricably linked to a military and political nightmare. The very institution that had once guaranteed stability, the professional, loyal Roman army, became the greatest source of instability. In the 3rd century, the empire fractured into competing regions, each with its own emperor proclaimed by their legions. For 50 years, barracks emperors rose and fell with bloody frequency, their reigns often ending in assassination rather than natural death. This constant civil war drained the empire's manpower and treasure, forcing armies to fight each other instead of guarding the frontiers. When the Emperor Diocletian finally restored order, it came at a terrible cost: the transformation of the Roman state into a rigid, top-down, militarized autocracy. To control inflation, he fixed prices by decree, a move that stifled commerce and innovation. To ensure tax revenue, he tied farmers to their land and sons to their fathers' professions, creating a less mobile, less free, and ultimately less dynamic society. The empire was saved from immediate collapse, but it was saved by becoming a different, more brittle kind of state, one that was far less adaptable to the immense challenges ahead. And those challenges were not solely man-made. Recent scientific evidence has added a powerful new dimension to the debate, suggesting that the empire was also battling forces entirely beyond its control. Ice core samples from Greenland and tree ring data from across Europe reveal a period of pronounced climatic instability during the empire's final centuries, including several severe volcanic eruptions that led to extended periods of global cooling. This meant shorter growing seasons, failed harvests, and widespread famine, which in turn weakened the population, reduced the tax base, and made it harder to feed and recruit armies. At the same time, archaeology and paleogenetics suggest that the empire was repeatedly hammered by devastating pandemics, most famously the Antonine and Cyprian plagues. These outbreaks may have killed a quarter or more of the population in some regions, creating a demographic catastrophe from which it never fully recovered. A society that is hungry, sick, and numerically diminished is a fragile one, and these environmental blows landed directly on top of the empire's existing political and economic fractures. This centuries-long argument between moral and structural explanations reveals a profound truth about history itself. The theories we favor often tell us more about our own time than about ancient Rome. Gibbon's focus on moral decay reflected the concerns of an Enlightenment intellectual skeptical of organized religion and wary of the luxury he saw in his own society. In the 20th century, the experience of world wars and the decline of empires led historians to focus more on grand systemic failures, economic collapse, administrative overstretch, and military overcommitment. Today, in an era acutely aware of climate change and global pandemics, we are naturally drawn to the environmental factors that may have played a decisive role. The fall of Rome isn't a single, solved mystery with a tidy answer. It is a sprawling, multifaceted tragedy that continues to challenge us to think about the complex, interwoven threads economic, political, military, environmental, and yes, even cultural, that hold a civilization together, and what happens when too many of them snap at once. Imagine a world where interconnected, thriving civilizations, from the sun-baked palaces of Mycenaean Greece to the bustling ports of the Hittite Empire and the lavish courts of Egyptian pharaohs, all vanished within the span of a single generation. This wasn't a slow decline, it was a catastrophic systems failure on a continental scale. Around the year 1177 BCE, the intricate globalized network of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean simply shattered. Major cities from Troy to Gaza were burned to the ground and abandoned. The art of writing was lost in Greece for centuries. Trade routes that had carried copper, tin, glass, and luxury goods for 300 years fell silent. It was one of the most dramatic and puzzling resets in human history, a dark age that descended with terrifying speed, and the question of why it happened remains one of history's greatest cold cases. For a long time, historians loved a simple villain, and they found one in the mysterious Sea Peoples. Egyptian temple reliefs at Medinet Habu, commissioned by Pharaoh Ramesses III, depict a chaotic naval battle against a confederation of these enigmatic invaders. The inscriptions boast of defeating these formidable warriors who had already toppled other great kingdoms, saying they came from the sea with a confidence that none could stand before them. The reliefs show them arriving with ox-drawn carts carrying their women and children, suggesting a desperate, migrating horde on the move. It's a compelling image, a wave of destruction that swept through the ancient world, toppling one palace after another. For decades, this was the go-to explanation, a barbarian invasion that destroyed the sophisticated but vulnerable civilizations of the Bronze Age. But as historians looked closer, the simple invasion theory began to fray at the edges. Who exactly were the Sea Peoples? The Egyptian texts list exotic names like the Peliset, who later likely became the Philistines, and the Shekelesh, but their origins remain hotly debated. Were they a cause of the collapse, or were they a symptom of it? A more modern interpretation suggests they might not have been a unified foreign army at all, but a mixed multitude of displaced people, refugees, and opportunistic pirates. Imagine the chaos if a combination of famine and war sent entire populations on the move, desperate for new land. These displaced groups, fighting for survival, could have become the very force that overwhelmed the weakened kingdoms they encountered, a destructive feedback loop of desperation and violence. This reframes them from a primary cause to a devastating consequence of a wider systemic failure, turning a simple story of us versus them into a much more complex human tragedy. This shift in thinking opened the door for other, even more profound suspects. What if the true assassins weren't invaders with swords, but invisible forces from the environment? Recent scientific detective work has provided staggering evidence for a centuries-long mega-drought that crippled the region. Paleoclimatologists studying mineral deposits in caves and the layers of sediment at the bottom of lakes can read the climate history of the Eastern Mediterranean like a book. Their findings point to a period of severe and prolonged aridification that began around 1250 BCE and lasted for nearly 200 years. For civilizations built on agriculture and taxed to their limits, this wasn't just a bad few seasons, it was an existential threat. Crop yields would have plummeted, famine would have spread, the tax base that supported the lavish palaces, the professional armies, and the complex bureaucracies would have evaporated. A kingdom starving and thirsty is a kingdom ripe for rebellion, migration, and collapse from within. At the same time, archaeologists have uncovered another potential culprit in the rubble of the destroyed cities, not just fire but earthquake. The Eastern Mediterranean sits at a terrifying crossroads of tectonic plates. The layer of destruction found at many sites from this period shows signs consistent not just with warfare, but with seismic activity. Some historians have proposed an earthquake storm, a century of intensified quakes rippling along the fault lines, repeatedly shaking the foundations of these powerful states. A palace or a city wall can be rebuilt once or twice, but a relentless series of such disasters could have stretched the resources and the morale of these societies to the breaking point, making recovery impossible and leaving them vulnerable to any other shock that came along. Faced with this overwhelming list of suspects, a growing number of scholars, like historian and archaeologist Eric Klein, argue that we should stop looking for a single, smoking gun. Instead, they propose a perfect storm or systems collapse theory. In this view, the late Bronze Age world was a precariously interconnected and deeply fragile system. Think of it like a complex mobile where every piece is perfectly balanced. A drought in Anatolia disrupts the grain supply to the Hittites. The Hittites, in crisis, can no longer send silver to Greece. The Mycenaean Greeks, their economy strained, can't acquire copper and tin to make bronze weapons. Pirates and raiders, perhaps driven from their homes by the same drought, exploit the weakening trade routes. Then an earthquake shatters a key city. The system is hit from every direction at once. Each individual stressor might have been survivable on its own, but together, in a rapid cascade, they created a failure that was catastrophic and total. The very interconnectedness that had been the source of their wealth and power became the channel through which their collapse spread, a sobering lesson in the vulnerabilities of a globalized world. This ongoing debate is a masterclass in how modern history works. It's no longer about choosing one explanation over another, but about weaving together evidence from disparate fields: climatology, archaeology, textual analysis, and sociology, to build a more nuanced and terrifying picture. The collapse of the Bronze Age world resists a simple narrative because it was not a simple event. It forces historians to be humble, to collaborate across disciplines, and to accept that the past can be as messy and multifaceted as the present. The darkness that fell around 1200 BC may have been a catastrophe for those who lived through it, but for us, it's a powerful reminder that civilizations are not invincible. They are complex ecosystems, and their greatest strength, their interdependence, can also be their most profound weakness when the perfect storm arrives. For centuries, the written words of ancient civilizations remained utterly silent, locked behind symbols that modern eyes could no longer understand. These weren't just lost languages, they were impenetrable codes, and the race to crack them was one of history's greatest intellectual adventures. A high-stakes competition filled with rivalries, brilliant insights, and spectacular blunders. The decipherment of these scripts was far more than a technical puzzle. It was the master key that would finally unlock the voices of the past, but the path to that key was a dramatic battlefield of egos and ideas. The most famous of these contests was the fierce struggle to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. For over 1,000 years, scholars were utterly baffled by these elegant, miniature pictures carved into temple walls and obelisks. The prevailing theory, championed by the likes of Athanasius Kircher in the 17th century, was that they were purely symbolic, each image representing a complex philosophical or religious idea, a kind of mystical code for initiates only. This misconception locked the decipherment in a wrong direction for generations. The critical breakthrough came not from a library, but from a battlefield. When Napoleon's campaign in Egypt unearthed the Rosetta Stone in 1799, it provided the first real clue. the same text written in three scripts: Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and hieroglyphs. Suddenly, there was a crib sheet. The race was on, and it quickly became a fierce international rivalry. In England, the physicist Thomas Young took the first major steps, correctly identifying that the cartouches, or oval rings, contained phonetic spellings of royal names like Ptolemy. But it was a brilliant, obsessive French linguist named Jean-François Champollion who would win the glory. Where others saw only symbols, Champollion saw a complex system that mixed phonetic signs with logographic ones. He worked feverishly, comparing the Rosetta texts with copies of other inscriptions, his health failing from the strain. The dramatic moment of breakthrough is legendary. In 1822, after confirming the phonetic values for the name Rameses, he raced into his brother's office, shouted, "G Tynes Elafare. I've got it," and then collapsed into a dead faint for 5 days. His work didn't just translate a language, it flung open the doors to 3,000 years of Egyptian history, allowing pharaohs, priests, and merchants to speak directly to the modern world. But if the decipherment of hieroglyphs was a dramatic sprint, the cracking of Linear B was a decades-long marathon of deductive reasoning and collaborative genius. Discovered on clay tablets at Knossos on Crete and later at Pylos on the Greek mainland, Linear B was an even tougher nut to crack. There was no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text to provide a roadmap. The script was a mystery, and the language it hid was an even deeper one. The academic world was divided into warring camps. The most prominent figure early on was the American archaeologist Alice Kober, a meticulous and fiercely intelligent scholar who worked herself to exhaustion. In an era before computers, she created vast handwritten concordances, analyzing the frequency and patterns of the script's 85 signs. She established that Linear B was an inflected language, meaning it used word endings like Latin or Greek, and she identified certain bridging signs that suggested grammatical endings. Her untimely death in 1950 at the age of 43 was a tragic loss, but she had laid the essential groundwork. The puzzle was finally solved by a most unlikely figure, Michael Ventris, an English architect who was not a professional academic but a fascinated amateur who had been obsessed with Linear B since he was a schoolboy. Treating it like a complex architectural problem, he used Kober's data and an architect's logical mind to begin a process of systematic elimination. He made a critical assumption that others had dismissed, that the language behind the script might be a very early form of Greek. This was a radical idea at the time, as most experts believed the Mycenaean palaces were ruled by a non-Greek people. Ventris began testing his theory, assigning sound values to signs based on patterns in the tablets. He shared his developing grid, a revolutionary tool that plotted the relationships between signs with other scholars, including the Cambridge classicist John Chadwick, who provided expert knowledge of early Greek. The moment of truth came when Ventris, applying his tentative values to a series of tablets that seemed to list inventories, found they clearly spelled out Greek words for common items like tai-rai, po for tripod, and ku-paro for cypress, a type of plant. It worked. The language was Greek, pushing the history of the Greek language back by at least 500 years and revolutionizing our understanding of the Bronze Age Aegean. The Mycenaeans weren't illiterate barbarians. They were administrators who kept detailed records of sheep, cloth, and chariot wheels. Ventris's breakthrough, announced on a BBC radio broadcast in 1952, was a stunning triumph of pure logic, but it was also built upon the painstaking work of his predecessor, Alice Kober, a testament to how decipherment is often a collaborative, if fiercely competitive, endeavor. Yet the act of reading these scripts was only the beginning of a new set of debates. Every translation is, by its very nature, an act of interpretation. A single ambiguous word can change the entire meaning of a text. In Egypt, does a certain phrase describe a pharaoh's military campaign as a glorious victory or a bloody stalemate? The translator's choice, influenced by their own understanding and biases, can shape our view of that ruler's entire reign. With Linear B, the very dryness of the administrative tablets, their focus on lists and inventories has led to heated arguments. Some historians see this as evidence of a centralized, bureaucratic, and perhaps even oppressive palace economy that controlled every aspect of production. Others caution that we are only reading the paperwork of the elite. The vibrant poetry, the personal letters, the literature of these people would have been written on perishable materials like papyrus or leather, which have long since turned to dust. Our view of their world is therefore irrevocably skewed toward the quantitative, the economic, the royal. We have their spreadsheets, but we have lost their songs. The story of decipherment is a powerful reminder that our access to the past is never guaranteed or easy. It is a hard-won right, earned through the brilliance, perseverance, and sometimes the rivalries of dedicated scholars who refuse to let the voices of antiquity remain silent. They teach us that history is not just discovered in the ground, it is also constructed in the mind, through the painstaking process of unlocking language itself. And they leave us with a humbling thought. For every script we have cracked, like hieroglyphs and Linear B, there are others that still guard their secrets, like Linear A and the ancient script of the Indus Valley civilization, silent reminders that the past still holds countless stories waiting for the right person to listen. Perhaps no historical inquiry is more fraught with tension, more layered with personal faith and academic rigor, than the quest to uncover the man known as Jesus of Nazareth. This isn't just a scholarly debate. For billions, it touches the very core of religious identity, while for others, it represents the ultimate test of historical method. The central question seems simple on its face. Was Jesus a real first-century Jewish preacher from Galilee whose life and teachings were later amplified by his followers? Or is he a figure constructed primarily from theology and myth, a symbolic rather than a historical creation? This divide has produced centuries of fierce and often deeply personal disagreement, turning the search for the historical Jesus into one of the most complex and contentious endeavors in all of historical study. The challenge begins with the nature of the evidence itself. Unlike figures such as Julius Caesar or Augustus, who left behind inscriptions, coins, and extensive contemporary histories, Jesus left no writings of his own. Our primary sources are the four canonical Gospels of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But these texts were not written as modern, dispassionate biographies. The earliest, the Gospel of Mark, was composed around 70 CE, roughly 40 years after Jesus' traditional date of death. The others followed decades later. They are faith documents written by communities of believers to proclaim their theological conviction that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God. Their purpose was to inspire conversion and strengthen faith, not to provide an objective historical record. They contain clearly metaphorical and theological elements, from the virgin birth and the miracles to the resurrection itself, which many historians treat as articles of faith rather than verifiable historical events. Outside the Bible, references are scarce and late. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus mentions Jesus in a passage that many scholars believe was later edited by Christian scribes to be more flattering. The Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius write about Jesus' execution and the existence of his followers, but they were writing decades after the fact, relying on second-hand reports. This evidentiary tightrope forces historians to employ a rigorous and often controversial set of methodological tools to sift history from theology. This sifting process has given rise to competing schools of thought, each with its own criteria for determining what can be considered historical. On one end of the spectrum are the mythicists, who argue that there is insufficient evidence to conclude a historical Jesus existed at all. They contend that the story is a synthesis of earlier pagan mystery religions, dying and rising god myths, and Old Testament prophecies that were woven together into a narrative about a celestial being, which was only later mistakenly placed in a historical setting. While this view remains a minority position among academic historians, it has gained traction in popular circles, fueled by the undeniable similarities between Jesus and pre-existing mythological figures. On the other end are scholars who firmly believe in a historical core, but they fiercely debate its extent. This is where groups like the controversial Jesus Seminar, active in the 1980s and 90s, made their mark. Their methodology was radically skeptical, using colored beads to vote on the authenticity of every saying attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. They concluded that only a small fraction, perhaps 18%, likely originated with the historical figure. They argued that the authentic Jesus was an itinerant Jewish wisdom teacher and social radical, whose apocalyptic message about the coming kingdom of God was later transformed by his followers into a theology about his own divine identity after his shocking execution. The seminar's work, very public and deliberately provocative, sparked outrage among many conservative Christians and skepticism from other historians who found their voting method overly simplistic and their criteria for authenticity unfairly biased against the miraculous and the spiritual. Between these poles lies a broad spectrum of opinion. Many mainstream historians accept the basic premise that a Jewish preacher named Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, preached a message of ethical renewal and the coming kingdom of God, gathered followers, caused a disturbance in the temple in Jerusalem, and was consequently crucified by the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate around 30 CE. The debates then rage over the details. Was he primarily an apocalyptic prophet warning of the end times, a charismatic healer and exorcist, a Jewish reformer, or a political rebel subtly opposing Roman occupation? Each interpretation draws on different strands of the gospel tradition and places emphasis on different social and political contexts of first-century Judea. The intensity of this debate stems from the fact that it can never be just about history. For believers, the historical reality of Jesus is foundational. His life, death, and resurrection are singular events that grant meaning to human existence. To question that history can feel like an attack on the core of faith itself. For secular historians, the challenge is to apply the same critical methods used for any ancient figure without being swayed by 2,000 years of religious tradition and cultural weight. This forces a constant negotiation between the canons of historical evidence and the powerful currents of faith, identity, and culture. The quest for the historical Jesus, in all its complexity, stands as the ultimate example of how the same sparse collection of ancient texts and artifacts can be woven into entirely different narratives, each revealing as much about the weaver as about the figure they are trying to portray. For generations, the grand narratives of antiquity were overwhelmingly a story about men by men. The history books were filled with the deeds of kings, philosophers, and generals, while the lives of women were often relegated to the footnotes if they appeared at all. They were depicted as silent, passive figures, dutiful wives, priestesses, or occasionally scheming queens, their complexity and agency lost to time. But starting in the latter half of the 20th century, a powerful shift began. Feminist scholars launched a determined campaign to ask a revolutionary question. What about the other half of humanity? This wasn't about inserting women into the existing historical narrative. It was about fundamentally transforming our understanding of ancient societies by listening for the voices that had been deliberately silenced or simply overlooked. Their method was a radical re-examination of the entire body of evidence, looking at familiar sources with new eyes and seeking out entirely new ones buried in the archaeological record. This scholarly revolution began with a critical rereading of the ancient texts that had long formed the foundation of history. Instead of taking the words of a Roman historian like Tacitus at face value when he made sweeping generalizations about female nature, scholars began to read him against the grain. They asked not what he said about women, but why he said it. What political or social agenda was his commentary serving? This approach revealed that many of the ancient sources were not objective reports but prescriptive literature, written by elite men to dictate how women should behave, which often tells us more about male anxieties than female reality. At the same time, these scholars went searching for the rare texts that offered a glimpse of women's own experiences. They pored over personal letters preserved on Egyptian papyrus, like those from a woman named Hilarion to her husband, instructing him on what to do if her unborn child was a girl. They studied the poetry of Sappho, which expressed female desire and community with an intensity that later male editors tried to suppress. They decoded funerary inscriptions commissioned by women for their female relatives, which spoke of love, loss, and professional accomplishments far beyond the domestic sphere. These fragments, though often brief, became invaluable windows into a world of female action and emotion. Yet the most dramatic discoveries came not from libraries but from the ground. Archaeology provides a material record that is often free from the biases of male authors. The analysis of grave goods has been particularly transformative. For decades, if a skeleton was buried with jewelry and domestic tools, it was automatically classified as a female burial. A skeleton buried with weapons was male. But this simplistic binary is now being forcefully challenged. Bioarchaeologists now use scientific techniques like DNA analysis to determine biological sex, and they've found numerous examples where the artifacts don't match the expected gender. A biologically female skeleton buried with a spear and a dagger forces a complete reconsideration of what weaponry meant in that society. Was it a mark of a warrior, a symbol of authority, or something else entirely? These findings shatter our assumptions and suggest that ancient gender roles were far more fluid and complex than our traditional histories ever allowed. This new lens has ignited fascinating and heated debates about societies we thought we knew. Take the case of Sparta, long romanticized for its unique social structure. Ancient sources like Plutarch claimed Spartan women were unusually free. They could own land, receive an education, and participate in athletics. Traditional historians often dismissed this as exaggerated propaganda or a peculiar outlier. But feminist scholars have taken this evidence seriously, arguing that Spartan women's economic power, derived from owning nearly 40% of the land, gave them a significant and undeniable influence over Spartan politics and society, making them a formidable force behind the famed Spartan military machine. This reinterpretation doesn't just add women to the story, it changes our understanding of how Spartan power actually functioned. Similarly, in Rome, the story of the empresses has been completely overhauled. Figures like Livia, the wife of Augustus, were long portrayed in the historical sources as scheming, poison-wielding manipulators behind the throne, a trope designed to discredit their influence. By re-examining the evidence, including portraits, coins, and inscriptions, scholars have argued that these women were not merely shadowy manipulators but essential political partners and adept players in the complex game of imperial power. They managed vast networks of patronage, acted as diplomatic bridges, and carefully crafted their public image to stabilize their husbands' rule. Their power wasn't a sinister aberration. It was a structural feature of the early Roman Empire, and acknowledging it gives us a much richer and more accurate picture of how the palace actually worked. The effort to recover women's history is about far more than just filling in gaps. It is a profound demonstration of how expanding our lens doesn't just add new characters to an old play, it forces us to rewrite the entire script. By asking new questions of old evidence and embracing the insights from archaeology, we are learning that women in the ancient world were not a monolithic group. They were business owners, priests, poets, physicians, and yes, sometimes powerful political actors. This ongoing project challenges the very core of historical practice, proving that who we choose to look for in the past determines what we ultimately find, and that a history that ignores half its participants is not just incomplete, it is fundamentally inaccurate. For much of modern history, the story of the ancient world was presented with a very clear and unquestioned hierarchy, a narrative crafted in the lecture halls and museums of Europe. In this telling, ancient Greece stood as the miraculous birthplace of reason, democracy, and philosophy, a pure European wellspring of everything that constituted civilization. Rome was its powerful heir, spreading this enlightened culture across the known world, and the other great societies, Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, India, were cast in supporting roles, often portrayed as static, mystical, despotic, and ultimately inferior. They were the ancient Orient, a fascinating but backward other against which the rational, progressive West could define itself. This framework wasn't just an academic preference, it was a deeply political project, used to justify colonialism by suggesting that European domination was simply the latest chapter in a long story of Western superiority stretching back to the ancients. This entrenched Eurocentric view was directly and forcefully challenged by the rise of post-colonial historiography in the latter half of the 20th century. Emerging from the intellectual ferment of newly independent nations across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, post-colonial scholars began to ask a devastatingly simple question: who does this history serve? They argued that traditional Western historiography was not a neutral, objective science but a form of power, a tool that had been used to legitimize colonial rule by constructing a past where Europe was always the destined leader and everyone else was destined to be led. This meant systematically dismantling the myth of Greek exceptionalism, the idea that their achievements sprang fully formed from the minds of philosophers like Athena from the head of Zeus, with no meaningful debt to the older, richer cultures that surrounded them. No single work detonated a larger explosive charge in this academic landscape than Martin Bernal's controversial and monumental work, Black Athena, first published in 1987. Bernal, a scholar of modern China with a deep knowledge of ancient languages, launched a two-front assault on traditional classics. First, he revived an older, ancient model, which acknowledged what the Greeks themselves had always said, that their culture was profoundly shaped by colonists from Egypt and Phoenicia, who brought with them the seeds of religion, art, and science. Bernal argued this model had been deliberately replaced in the 18th and 19th centuries by an Aryan model, which severed Greece from its African and Semitic roots to recast it as the pure product of Indo-European invaders from the north, a narrative that better suited the racist and anti-Semitic ideologies of the time. His second, even more provocative argument was right there in the title, that the primary Egyptian influence on Greece came from a civilization that was fundamentally African and black. Bernal used linguistic, archaeological, and mythological evidence to argue for a pervasive Egyptian and Phoenician presence in the prehistoric Aegean. The reaction from the academic establishment was swift, furious, and often deeply personal. traditional classicists attacked his methodology, pointing out his reliance on disputed etymologies and speculative mythological connections. They accused him of being an amateur, of cherry-picking evidence, and of committing the same sin. He accused others of prioritizing political desire over scholarly rigor. Yet, even as many of his specific claims were dismantled, the broader shockwave of his argument was irreversible. Bernal had successfully exposed the political and racial biases that had underpinned over a century of classical scholarship, forcing the entire field to confront its own uncomfortable history and its complicity in colonial narratives. The firestorm over Black Athena opened the floodgates for a much wider and more nuanced project, the decolonization of Antiquity. This isn't about simply inverting the old hierarchy to claim Egypt was superior to Greece. It's a far more radical endeavor aimed at dismantling the hierarchy altogether. It involves consciously peeling away the layers of bias that have distorted our view for centuries. For example, the long-standing description of the Persian Empire as a decadent, Oriental despotism is now recognized as a propaganda trope inherited from its Greek enemies, who needed to portray the Persians as tyrannical and soft to contrast with their own self-image as free and manly warriors. In reality, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was a breathtakingly sophisticated administrative state that respected local customs and religions, built a vast network of roads and canals, and maintained stability across a diverse realm for centuries, a model of governance that Rome would later emulate. Similarly, the dazzling intellectual and artistic achievements of the Indian subcontinent, from the precise astronomical calculations of the Vedanga Jyotisha to the sophisticated statecraft of Cortelia's Arthashastra, are no longer dismissed as exotic curiosities but studied as serious, independent contributions to human knowledge that developed along their own complex trajectories, not failed attempts to be Greek. This decolonial shift is also profoundly physical. It changes how artifacts are presented in museums, moving them away from sterile, decontextualized displays of art and toward explanations that reconnect them to the living cultures and people they came from. It questions who gets to tell these stories, advocating for the inclusion of scholars from regions that produced these civilizations, whose perspectives and questions might differ radically from those trained exclusively in the Western tradition. This ongoing struggle to decolonize the past is often messy, uncomfortable, and fiercely contested, and that is precisely why it is so vital. It recognizes that history is never just about the past. It is always a conversation with the present. The stories we tell about antiquity shape our modern identities, our national myths, and our understanding of our place in the world. By challenging the old, biased narratives, we aren't destroying history. We are finally taking it seriously, acknowledging its complexity and the multitude of voices that have always been part of the human story. This process ensures that the ancient world is not a dead monument to a single idea of civilization, but a vibrant, global tapestry of innovation, exchange, and shared humanity, whose lessons are far richer and more relevant than we ever imagined. Of all the ancient mysteries we've explored, none has proven more stubbornly alluring or more endlessly adaptable than the legend of Atlantis. This isn't just a story. It's a mirror, reflecting back whatever an era most desires to see, a lost utopia, a warning from the deep, or evidence of advanced ancient technology. The entire saga begins with just a few pages of dialogue written by the Greek philosopher Plato around 360 BCE in his works the Timaeus and the Critias. He presents the story not as a myth, but as a supposedly true account passed down from his ancestor, the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais. These priests described a powerful island empire located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we know as the Strait of Gibraltar, that had attempted to conquer the Mediterranean 9,000 years earlier. They were only defeated by the brave, primeval Athenians, after which the entire island of Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the ocean forever. For Plato, this was almost certainly a moral and political allegory. He was creating a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial hubris and moral decay, using a fictional, arrogant civilization to illustrate what happens when a society abandons virtue for greed and military aggression. His perfect Athens was the ideal state that triumphed over this corrupt power, serving as a model for his philosophical ideas. Yet, almost from the moment the ink dried, people began asking the irresistible question, what if it was real? This simple query has launched 1,000 ships, both metaphorical and literal, sending generations of scholars, adventurers, and amateur sleuths on a globe-trotting quest to find the sunken continent. The competing theories are a fascinating map of human imagination itself, each one placing Atlantis in a location that aligns with the cultural and scientific preoccupations of its time. In the late 19th century, as the study of ancient civilizations exploded, Ignatius Donnelly's best-selling book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, argued it was a very real, technologically advanced continent in the mid-Atlantic. He proposed it was the mother culture that seeded all the great ancient civilizations, from the Egyptians to the Maya, and that its destruction was a historical memory of a colossal geological catastrophe. Donnelly's work, while dismissed by academics, captured the public's imagination and set the template for all future Atlantology. As archaeology advanced, so did the proposed locations. The spectacular discovery of the Minoan civilization on Crete and Thera, with its magnificent palaces and its sudden volcanic collapse around 1600 BC, provided a compelling new candidate. Here was a sophisticated maritime empire that was indeed largely wiped out by a cataclysmic volcanic eruption, an event so massive it likely inspired myths and disaster stories across the region. Could the eruption of Thera be the day and night of fire that Plato described, with the Minoans serving as the historical core for the Atlantean Empire? It's a compelling and academically respected theory, though it requires compressing Plato's 9,000-year timeline dramatically and moving the location from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Other theories have placed Atlantis everywhere from the sunken landmass of Doggerland in the North Sea to the Richat structure in the Sahara Desert, a strange geological formation that, from above, looks strikingly like the concentric rings Plato described. Some of the most fanciful, though popular, ideas have tied it to psychic revelations or to extraterrestrial visitors, pushing the legend firmly into the realm of modern myth-making. The vast majority of historians and archaeologists today stand firmly in the camp that Atlantis is a powerful philosophical fiction, a brilliant thought experiment created by one of history's greatest minds. They point out that no other ancient Greek writer, not Herodotus, not Thucydides, not Aristotle, ever mentions such a civilization, which would be a staggering omission if it were part of any genuine historical tradition. For them, the search for a real Atlantis is a classic case of mistaking the map for the territory, of taking a detailed allegory and trying to force the physical world to fit its description. Yet, even as they dismiss the literal existence of Plato's island, many acknowledge the incredible value the search has created. The relentless pursuit of Atlantis has, ironically, driven genuine and profound scholarly discovery. It was a major motivator for early archaeology, pushing explorers to investigate sunken cities and forgotten cultures. It has fueled advanced research into paleoclimatology and geology, as scientists seek to understand the very real mega-tsunamis and catastrophic volcanic events that have shaped human history and likely inspired many of our most enduring flood myths. The legend forces us to grapple with how historical memory works, how real disasters can be transformed over centuries into powerful, symbolic stories. In the end, the enduring power of Atlantis lies not in finding it, but in the endless human drive to look. It speaks to our deep desire to believe in lost golden ages and forgotten wisdom, to find evidence that our world has known greatness before, and to uncover the profound truths that often lie hidden in the beautiful, ambiguous space between history and myth. For over 3,000 years, the story of the Trojan War has stood as one of humanity's most powerful epics, a sweeping tale of love, honor, gods, and the devastating cost of a 10-year siege over the most beautiful woman in the world. But beneath the shimmering surface of Homer's poetry lies a question that has haunted historians and archaeologists for centuries. Did any of it actually happen? Is the Iliad a brilliant but total work of fiction, or does it contain a kernel of historical truth, a memory of a real conflict that was passed down through generations of singers before being set into its final, glorious form? This isn't just an academic parlor game. The debate over Troy forces us to confront the very nature of history itself, asking where the line between legend and reality truly lies, and whether that line even exists. The search for a historical Troy began not with a shovel, but with a book. For much of the modern era, educated opinion held that Homer's Troy was a poetic fantasy, a never-never land invented to serve as a backdrop for his epic drama. That all changed in the 1870s with the spectacular, if brutally destructive, excavations of the German businessman Heinrich Schliemann. Convinced that the Iliad was factual history, he used it as a literal guidebook, identifying a large mound in Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey as the most likely site. His methods were catastrophic by modern standards. He famously sliced a gigantic trench through the center of the mound, carelessly demolishing layers of history in his single-minded quest for Homeric glory. But his dramatic discovery of a hoard of gold and jewelry, which he immediately dubbed Priam's treasure, seemed to vindicate his belief. He proclaimed to a stunned world, found the city of King Priam. The reality, as always, is far more complicated. The mound at Hisarlik is not a single city, but a palimpsest of them, with at least 9 major layers built one on top of the other over thousands of years. Schliemann had indeed found an ancient and important settlement, but the golden treasure he uncovered came from a layer, now known as Troy II, that dated to 1,000 years earlier than any possible Trojan War. The city that most likely corresponds to Homer's era is Troy 6 or 7, which was a large, heavily fortified citadel that showed clear signs of having been destroyed by a massive fire and violent conflict around the time period traditionally associated with the war, around 1250 BC. The evidence was tantalizing: collapsed walls, spent arrowheads, and skeletons hastily buried in the rubble, all pointing to a siege and a catastrophic end. For many, this was the smoking gun, the physical proof that the legend was rooted in a real, devastating war. Yet the skeptics were quick to point out the gaps. A destroyed city is not necessarily the destroyed city. Conflict was endemic in the Bronze Age world. The archaeological evidence from Hisarlik proves a war happened, but it doesn't prove it was the Trojan War described by Homer. Where are the specific details that would seal the deal? Where is the evidence of an enormous, decade-long Greek encampment? Where are the artifacts that can be definitively linked to the specific characters and events of the Iliad? The archaeological record provides a compelling setting, but the script for the drama that supposedly unfolded there remains frustratingly missing. This is where the debate truly ignites, dividing scholars into 2 passionate camps. On one side are those like the late German archaeologist Manfred Kaufmann, who directed excavations at Hisarlik for nearly 2 decades. Kaufmann's work was a game-changer. Through extensive geomagnetic surveys and careful digging, he revealed that the citadel was merely the heart of a much larger lower city, surrounded by defensive ditches and likely housing thousands of people. This was not a small outpost, it was a significant regional power, a wealthy trading hub perfectly positioned to control the vital sea routes through the Dardanelles. Its location alone made it an obvious target for rivals, and its wealth, derived from taxing trade, would have made it a prize worth fighting for. Kaufmann argued that this strategic and economic context made a major conflict not just possible but probable. He saw the Homeric legend as a distant, poetic echo of a very real struggle for control over this crucial node in the Bronze Age world. Arrayed against this view are the strict skeptics, who see the search for a historical Trojan War as a classic case of confirmation bias, where enthusiasts interpret ambiguous evidence to fit a pre-existing beloved story. They argue that the Iliad is a product of the 8th century BCE, a compilation of centuries of oral tradition that projects the political realities, military tactics, and material culture of its own time onto a vague and half-remembered past. The epic is filled with anachronisms: the use of iron weapons, the cremation of heroes, the description of shields that are out of place in the late Bronze Age but perfectly align with the world of Homer's own era. For these scholars, the Iliad is a magnificent tapestry woven from threads of memory, imagination, and contemporary observation, not a historical document. The fact that a city was destroyed at roughly the right time is, to them, a coincidence that has been inflated into a theory by the powerful allure of the story itself. This enduring controversy does more than just debate the existence of a single war. It fundamentally shapes how we understand the relationship between poetry and history, between memory and fact. The story of Troy teaches us that legends are not born in a vacuum. They often coalesce around a nucleus of real events, real places, and real traumas that are too significant for a culture to forget. Over centuries, these kernels are embellished, personified by gods and heroes, and shaped into a narrative that carries deeper cultural truths about honor, fate, and the human condition. The ongoing excavation at Hisarlik, now led by a new generation of archaeologists, continues to refine our picture. Each season's findings adds another piece to the puzzle, not to prove Homer right or wrong, but to understand the complex society that lived there, why it fell, and how its story became immortal. The search for the historical Troy, therefore, is not a quest that will end with a definitive yes or no. It is a continuous process of sifting through the layers of both earth and story, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful truths are not found in bare facts, but in the enduring power of the tales we tell about them. Now consider one of the most profound leaps in human history, the moment we first began to capture our thoughts, our accounts, and our laws in permanent, visible symbols. This wasn't just an invention, it was a transformation of consciousness itself, allowing ideas to travel across space and time. But how did this revolutionary technology come about? Did it spark to life in a single, brilliant moment and then spread across the globe, or did the human mind, faced with similar challenges in different corners of the world, independently stumble upon the same incredible solution multiple times? This is the core of the fierce debate between monogenesis and polygenesis, an argument that goes far beyond academic semantics. It strikes at the heart of how we understand human innovation and the very nature of civilization. The traditional and for a long time dominant view was that of monogenesis. the idea that writing was invented just once in one place and then diffused outward, carried by traders, migrants, or conquerors to other cultures who adapted it to their own needs. The most compelling candidate for this single point of origin is ancient Mesopotamia, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians developed a system of accounting marks on clay tablets to keep track of goods like grain, sheep, and beer. These early pictographs, known as cuneiform because of their wedge-shaped marks made with a stylus, slowly evolved from simple pictures into a more abstract script capable of recording complex language. Proponents of the single origin theory point to the staggering improbability of such a complex system being invented multiple times. They argue that the basic concept of representing speech with symbols is so counterintuitive, so revolutionary, that it must have happened only once. From this Mesopotamian cradle, the idea of writing then traveled along trade routes to Egypt, inspiring the development of hieroglyphs around the same time, and perhaps even further afield, influencing other nascent systems. This view suggests a kind of intellectual Big Bang, a single point of light that gradually illuminated the world. But this neat narrative is powerfully challenged by the stubborn fact of ancient China and Mesoamerica. Chinese script appears suddenly and seemingly fully formed on oracle bones during the Shang dynasty around 1200 BCE, used for divination rituals. This system is utterly unique in its structure and principles, based on a complex combination of logographic and phonetic elements that look nothing like cuneiform or hieroglyphs. Even more strikingly, the Maya of Mesoamerica developed their own elaborate logosyllabic writing system completely independently, with the earliest known examples appearing around 300 BCE. There is absolutely no evidence of any cultural contact between the Maya and the ancient civilizations of the Old World at this time. The Maya script, with its intricate, beautiful glyphs that record historical events, astronomical observations, and royal genealogies, is a product of its own unique environment and intellectual tradition. Its very existence is a massive obstacle for the monogenesis theory, a clear and brilliant example of polygenesis, the independent invention of writing. So how do we reconcile these two opposing views? The evidence suggests a more nuanced middle path. It's possible that the idea of writing, the abstract concept that spoken language can be visually represented, might have diffused over vast distances through indirect, long-range cultural contact that left no clear archaeological trace. A trader from Mesopotamia wouldn't have to travel all the way to China to spread the idea. It could have hopped from culture to culture, changing and evolving with each step, planting a seed that then grew into something entirely new and adapted to its local soil. In this scenario, the spark of the idea was borrowed, but the fuel, the specific symbols, the grammar, the entire system was a local invention. This would make the development of writing what scholars call stimulus diffusion, where the concept is transmitted, but the execution is independently created. This explains the profound differences between the systems while acknowledging that a breakthrough of this magnitude is more likely to be inspired than spontaneously generated in complete isolation multiple times. The implications of this debate ripple far beyond just dating the first scribe. It forces us to ask fundamental questions about human creativity. Does it celebrate the unique genius of individual cultures like the Maya or the Shang, who engineered their own path to literacy against all odds? Or does it highlight the incredible power of cultural exchange and the interconnectedness of even the ancient world? The answer shapes our entire understanding of human progress. A monogenetic view suggests a more linear, connected progression of civilization, while a polygenetic view presents a tapestry of parallel, independent innovations. Ultimately, the origins of writing remain shrouded in the same mystery as the origins of language itself. It stands as a testament to the human mind's relentless drive to communicate, to record, and to be remembered, a drive so powerful that it may have ignited not just once, but in several brilliant flashes across the ancient world, forever changing the course of our species. Moving from the abstract origins of writing, we arrive at one of history's most potent and divisive narratives, the Exodus. This is not merely an ancient story. It is a foundational epic of liberation that has shaped Jewish, Christian, and Muslim identity for millennia, a powerful symbol of hope for the oppressed. But for historians, it presents an immense and perhaps unsolvable riddle. Did a mass migration of hundreds of thousands of Israelites truly escape from Egyptian bondage in a dramatic divine intervention? Or are we looking at a powerful national myth, composed centuries later to define a people and their relationship with their God? This question forces a collision between faith, archaeology, and history, creating a scholarly divide that is as much about modern identity as it is about ancient events. The quest for a historical exodus begins with the biblical text itself, a detailed narrative filled with specific place names, characters, and events. The story of Moses, the 10 plagues, the parting of the sea, and the 40 years of wandering in the desert is presented as a definitive account of national origins. For a long time, the assumption was that archaeology would eventually unearth proof. Expeditions have scoured the Sinai Peninsula for decades, searching for any trace of a large population moving through its harsh terrain, a piece of Egyptian jewelry, a specific type of pottery, evidence of campsites. Yet, despite a century of intense exploration, the Sinai has yielded nothing. There are no artifacts, no graves, no remnants of settlements that can be conclusively linked to a massive group of people living there for 2 generations. This profound silence in the archaeological record is the single biggest argument against a literal, large-scale exodus as described in the Bible. This absence has led many prominent archaeologists, like Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, to propose a radically different origin story for ancient Israel. His theory, often called the Peasants' Revolt or internal Canaanite origins model, is based on extensive surveys of the central hill country of Canaan. What they found was not evidence of invaders, but of a dramatic social transformation. Around 1200 BC, coinciding with the collapse of the Great Bronze Age empires, there was a sudden and massive explosion of small, rustic villages in these highlands. These were not the fortified cities of the Canaanite lowlands. They were simple settlements with a distinct lack of pig bones and a unique pottery style, suggesting a new, cohesive cultural group. Finkelstein and others argue that these were not foreigners arriving from Egypt, but disenfranchised Canaanites, peasants, herders, and perhaps even escaped slaves who broke away from the collapsing city-states on the coast and forged a new identity in the hills. The Exodus story, in this view, was a later theological masterpiece woven together during the later kingdom of Judah. It took this complex internal social revolution and transformed it into a powerful, unifying narrative of divine liberation from a foreign oppressor, serving to strengthen a national identity under threat from empires like Assyria and Babylon. Yet, just when the case for a purely mythical exodus seems strongest, a handful of tantalizing clues emerge from the Egyptian sands to complicate the picture. The most famous is the Merneptah stele, an inscribed victory monument erected by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah around 1208 BC. In it, he boasts of his victories in Canaan, stating, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more." This is the earliest and only known mention of Israel in ancient Egyptian records, and it proves that by the late 13th century BC, a people or group identified as Israel was already established in the land of Canaan. This doesn't prove the Exodus happened, but it does shatter the idea that Israel was a later invention. It places an entity called Israel right in the general time frame the Exodus is traditionally set, showing they were a significant enough force to be noted by the pharaoh himself. Other fragments hint at a cultural memory of Semitic people in Egypt. Papyri from the reign of Pharaoh Sogkotep Roman III mention Aperu or Habaru laborers, a term often used for stateless, nomadic peoples working on state construction projects. The famous Brooklyn Papyrus lists dozens of servants with Semitic names within an Egyptian household, and the dramatic story of Ipuwer, an Egyptian text that describes the Nile turning to blood and a world turned upside down by chaos, bears a striking, though perhaps coincidental, resemblance to the biblical plagues. While none of these pieces provide direct evidence for the Exodus narrative, they do paint a picture of a time when Semitic peoples were indeed present in Egypt, sometimes in subservient roles, and when tales of great calamities were part of the cultural fabric. It's possible that a smaller historical event, perhaps the escape of a group of Semitic slaves or the expulsion of a Hyksos-related population, became the kernel of truth that, over centuries of storytelling, was magnified into the grand epic we have today. This debate is so heated because it is about more than pottery shards and ancient inscriptions. It strikes at the heart of identity and belief. For many people of faith, the Exodus is not just a story but a foundational truth that defines their relationship with God as a liberator. To question its historicity can feel like an attack on the very core of that faith. For historians, the insistence on treating a religious text as a straightforward historical document can feel like a rejection of their methodological tools. This creates a deep ideological divide where the same evidence is interpreted through entirely different lenses. The absence of proof is seen by one side as a test of faith and by the other as definitive disproof. The Merneptah stele is either a crucial anchor of historicity or merely a proof of existence that says nothing about origins. The story sits in that difficult space between history and theology, a powerful narrative whose deepest truths may not be about the precise details of a journey, but about the enduring human hope for freedom, the formation of a community bound by covenant, and the profound idea that the ultimate power in the universe sides with the oppressed against the mightiest empire on earth. When the ruins of ancient Crete were first uncovered in the early 20th century, they presented a vision of the past so dazzlingly different from anything known before that it seemed to promise an entirely new chapter in human history. At the helm of this discovery was the British archaeologist Arthur Evans, who, upon unearthing the vast, labyrinthine palace complex at Knossos, didn't just name this lost civilization after the mythical King Minos, he set about reconstructing its soul. What Evans saw in the colorful, flowing frescoes, the elegant pottery, and the absence of obvious fortifications was a society of breathtaking sophistication and, crucially, profound peace. He envisioned the Minoans as a people governed not by warrior kings, but by a powerful, motherly spiritual authority. The famous fresco of a graceful, bare-chested young woman confidently handling snakes, the numerous figurines of female deities, and the central role of bull-leaping rituals all pointed, in his view, to a culture where a great goddess reigned supreme, a matriarchal utopia that stood in stark contrast to the later, warlike Greeks. For Evans and his contemporaries, living in an age of industrial violence and rigid gender roles, Minoan Crete became a romanticized alternative, a peaceful, artistic paradise that reflected their own deep yearning for a world not dominated by conflict and masculine aggression. This idyllic interpretation, however, began to fracture under the weight of new evidence and shifting scholarly perspectives. The first major challenge came from the mainland of Greece itself, with the excavation of the great citadels of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. Here, the archaeology presented a completely different picture. These were fortresses with massive cyclopean walls built for defense, grand graves stuffed with bronze weaponry, gold death masks, and art that glorified the hunt and warfare. The Mycenaeans were unapologetically a warrior aristocracy. For a long time, the two cultures were seen as polar opposites, the peaceful, artistic Minoans of Crete and the brutal, militaristic Mycenaeans of the mainland. This clean distinction was satisfying, but it was too simple. The real turning point, the discovery that would forever entwine their stories and complicate Evans's peaceful vision, was the decipherment of Linear B by Michael Ventris in 1952. The clay tablets found at both Knossos and on the mainland were not poetry or sacred texts. They were bureaucratic inventories, and the language they recorded was an early form of Greek. This meant that in its final phase, the Palace of Knossos was administered by Greek-speaking Mycenaeans. The question suddenly became, were the Minoans conquered, or had they always been more similar to their mainland neighbors than anyone had guessed? The Linear B tablets provided an unprecedented, if dry, window into the economics of power. They revealed a highly centralized, top-down administration that meticulously tracked the production and distribution of goods across the realm. The palace was the engine of the economy, recording vast quantities of wool, cloth, grain, and olive oil, as well as bronze and weapons. This was not the ledger of a simple, peace-loving theocracy. It was the paperwork of a complex state with a powerful ruling class that controlled resources, including the means of war. The tablets mention a wide array of military equipment: chariots, corselets, arrows, and spears allocated to named individuals. They also detailed the granting of land in exchange for military service, a clear sign of a stratified society organized for defense and likely aggression. The image that emerged was not of a matriarchal utopia but of a wanax, a powerful king, presiding over a network of officials, craftsmen, soldiers, and slaves, all carefully monitored by an army of scribes. The beautiful art and apparent lack of walls now had to be re-evaluated. Perhaps the Minoans' security came not from a universal commitment to peace, but from their supreme power as a thalassocracy, a naval empire so dominant in the Aegean that they felt no need to build massive land defenses. Their peace may have been enforced by the invisible threat of their ships, a concept far removed from Evans's idealistic vision. This dramatic reassessment shows with perfect clarity how the biases of the present inevitably shape our view of the past. Arthur Evans was a man of his Victorian and Edwardian era, reacting against its industrial grimness and fascinated by theories of ancient matriarchies. He looked at Minoan art and saw what he wanted to see, a refined, non-violent alternative to the world around him. Later 20th century scholars living through world wars and the Cold War were far more skeptical of such idealism. They were primed to see power, administration, and military force as the fundamental engines of any complex society. They looked at the same evidence and saw not a peaceable kingdom, but a sophisticated, controlling state apparatus. The current understanding is one of fascinating complexity, a blend of both views. The Minoans were indeed uniquely artistic and likely gave a more prominent role to women in religious life than their contemporaries. The centrality of the bull-leaping ritual, an incredibly dangerous acrobatic performance, also suggests a society that channeled its aggression and search for prestige into spectacular ritualized combat rather than open warfare, at least initially. Yet they were also capable of violence, competition, and, as the Linear B tablets prove, highly organized military preparation. The story is no longer a choice between a matriarchal paradise and a warrior kingdom, but an acknowledgement that this brilliant civilization contained the capacity for both profound artistic beauty and organized power, a duality that makes them not a lost utopia, but recognizably, compellingly human. For generations, our entire understanding of the brutal, generation-long conflict between Athens and Sparta was filtered through a single, masterful voice, that of Thucydides, an Athenian general and historian who lived through the war and dedicated his life to recording it. He proclaimed that his work would be a possession for all time, a strictly factual account free from the myth-making of his predecessors, written to uncover the universal patterns of human behavior that drive such catastrophic events. His narrative is so powerful, so compelling in its analysis of power, fear, and honor, that it has dominated the historical landscape for 2 millennia, becoming the textbook example of how history should be written. We've seen the war almost entirely through his eyes, the brilliant but flawed Athenian democracy overreaching, provoked by Spartan paranoia, in a tragic clash that was, in his view, inevitable given the shifting balance of power. His authority seemed unassailable. He was there, he fought in it. Who could possibly know better? Yet, in recent decades, a new generation of scholars has begun to step back from Thucydides' monumental text, not to dismiss it, but to read it with a more critical eye. They've started asking a crucial question: can any historian, no matter how brilliant, ever be truly objective, especially one who was not just an observer but a participant on one side of the conflict? The answer has been a resounding no, and this reevaluation has opened up a thrilling new chapter in understanding the Peloponnesian War. The first crack in the Thucydidean edifice is his undeniable Athenian perspective. While he often criticizes Athenian strategy and leadership, his entire framework is rooted in the Athenian worldview. The Spartans and their allies remain largely silent, their motivations often explained through the lens of Athenian assumptions rather than their own internal logic. Thucydides portrays the Spartan king Archidamus as cautious and wise, for instance, but we have no Spartan speeches to counterbalance the soaring, invented orations of the Athenian leader Pericles, which Thucydides uses to articulate his own theories about power and empire. The history, for all its grandeur, is a one-sided masterpiece. Furthermore, modern historians have highlighted the profound influence of Thucydides' own literary and philosophical ambitions. His famous statement that the war was caused by the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta is a beautifully concise and powerful thesis. But is it the whole story, or is it a dramatic simplification crafted by a writer seeking a universal, timeless lesson? By framing the conflict as an inevitable clash driven by impersonal forces of power politics, he may have downplayed other critical and messier factors. What about the fierce economic competition between Athens and Corinth, Sparta's key ally, over trade routes in the Corinthian Gulf? Corinth's desperate lobbying in Sparta, warning that Athenian control of the seas was strangling their economy, gets mentioned by Thucydides, but it's often treated as a secondary trigger rather than a primary engine of the conflict. Modern analyzers give this economic rivalry much greater weight, arguing that the Spartan elite, who were largely landowners uninterested in trade, were pushed into war by their commercially powerful and increasingly desperate Corinthian allies. The revisions go even deeper into the very fabric of Athenian society. Thucydides focuses on grand strategy, political speeches, and the actions of great men. But what was happening on the ground? Social historians have pointed to the devastating plague that ripped through Athens in the early years of the war, a catastrophe Thucydides describes in horrifying clinical detail because he himself survived it. Yet he doesn't fully explore its long-term societal impact. The plague killed perhaps a quarter of the city's population, including the revered Pericles. It shattered morale, eroded religious faith, and created a climate of desperation and lawlessness that paved the way for more ruthless and volatile leaders like Cleon to rise to power. This wasn't just a background event. It was a seismic shock that fundamentally altered Athens' political psychology and its ability to conduct the war rationally, a factor that goes far beyond Thucydides' neat balance of power model. Perhaps the most dramatic challenge to the traditional narrative comes from an entirely different field of study, climatology. Thucydides meticulously notes that the final, decisive blow for Athens, the catastrophic defeat of its Sicilian expedition, was the result of poor leadership and a desperate last-minute naval battle in the great harbor of Syracuse. But he doesn't mention the weather. Recent scientific analysis of tree rings from the region indicates that the year 413 BC, the exact year of the Athenian retreat, was one of the most severe droughts in the ancient period. This environmental evidence suggests a terrifying new dimension to the disaster. The Athenian army, already defeated and trying to retreat inland, would have been marching through a parched landscape, desperate for water that wasn't there, their strength failing with every step. The environment itself became an actor in the drama, a silent, brutal ally of the Syracusans that helped annihilate the Athenian force. This isn't in Thucydides' account, not because he was hiding it, but because he lacked the tools to see it. It reminds us that history is not just about human decisions, but also about the uncontrollable natural world in which those decisions are made. This ongoing scholarly conversation doesn't diminish Thucydides' genius. It enriches our understanding of the war he chronicled. He gave us the indispensable skeleton of events, the psychological depth, and a powerful analytical framework. Modern historians are putting flesh on those bones, adding layers of economic, social, and environmental context that he either overlooked, minimized, or could not have known. The result is not a rejection of his history, but a fulfillment of it. It proves that his work truly is a possession for all time, not because it is the final word, but because it is such a robust foundation for an endless conversation. The Peloponnesian War is no longer just Thucydides' story. It is a complex tapestry woven from countless threads, the ambitions of generals, the fears of farmers, the ledgers of merchants, and even the rainfall of centuries past, all coming together to tell a story that is far richer, more complicated, and more human than we ever imagined. Now picture a vast, interconnected web of routes stretching from the palaces of Chang'an in China to the bustling ports of Rome, a network that didn't just carry silk and spices, but also faiths, technologies, and diseases. This is the Silk Road, a term coined in the 19th century that conjures images of camel caravans moving peacefully under starry desert skies, a grand highway of cosmopolitan exchange where East met West in a spirit of mutual curiosity and profit. This romantic vision isn't entirely wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete, for beneath the glittering surface of this trade lay the hard realities of empire, the shadow of the sword, and the stark inequalities that made such grand exchanges possible in the first place. The great debate among historians is not whether the Silk Road existed, but what its fundamental nature truly was. Was it primarily a story of voluntary cultural connection, or was it a system built on conquest and exploitation? The argument for the Silk Road as a peaceful conduit of ideas is incredibly powerful and filled with compelling evidence. This was without doubt the world's first great information superhighway. Buddhism traveled from India through Central Asia and into China, its journey marked by magnificent cave temples carved into cliffsides at places like Dunhuang, which became a vast library of different faiths and languages. Paper-making technology, a Chinese invention, moved west, eventually revolutionizing administration and learning in the Islamic world and later Europe. The stirrup, a seemingly simple device, arrived in Europe from the East and would eventually change the nature of medieval warfare by creating the armored knight. These were transfers that happened not through force but through the slow, organic process of contact. Sogdian merchants, the master intermediaries of Central Asia, learned multiple languages and acted as cultural translators, facilitating deals and conversations between people from vastly different worlds. In the bustling caravanserais that dotted the routes, a Zoroastrian Persian, a Nestorian Christian monk, and a Chinese official could share a meal and stories, creating a fleeting, tangible multiculturalism that feels strikingly modern. This is the Silk Road of our dreams, a testament to the human desire to connect, share, and learn from one another. Yet, this cosmopolitan ideal could only exist within a framework of immense power and control. The Silk Road was not a free trade zone open to all. It was a network that flourished most brilliantly under the heel of a stable empire. The most famous example is the Pax Mongolica of the 13th and 14th centuries. After the brutal Mongol conquests had subjugated nearly the entire length of the route, they imposed a terrifying but effective peace. Banditry was ruthlessly suppressed, and standardized laws protected merchants moving across the vast expanse of their territory. The Venetian trader Marco Polo famously traveled these routes under Mongol protection, but this safety came at a horrific cost. It was guaranteed by the very same Mongol armies that had massacred entire cities that resisted them, turning the roads into a peaceful corridor through a landscape of conquered peoples. The peace was real, but it was a peace built on a foundation of overwhelming violence and coercion. Furthermore, the exchange was never between equals. The luxury goods that traveled west, silk, porcelain, lacquerware, were often paid for with vast quantities of silver and gold, creating a significant wealth drain on the Roman and later European economies. More disturbingly, the Silk Road was one of history's great engines of slavery. For centuries, Slavic, Turkic, and Caucasian peoples were captured and trafficked along these routes to serve as soldiers and servants in the caliphates of the Middle East and beyond. The vibrant intellectual centers of Baghdad and Samarkand, where scholars translated Greek philosophy and advanced mathematics, were often supported by the labor and wealth extracted from conquered lands and peoples. The cultural flowering was real, but it was subsidized by a brutal economy of human misery. Even the transmission of ideas wasn't always voluntary or welcome. The spread of religions was often a top-down affair, with rulers converting and then imposing their new faith on their subjects, using spiritual authority to consolidate political power along the trade routes they controlled. So, which interpretation is correct? The beautiful truth is that both are. The Silk Road was not one thing, but many things simultaneously. It was a space of both cooperation and coercion, of breathtaking cultural fusion and brutal exploitation. A single traveler on the road could be both a victim and a beneficiary of this system. A slave transported against their will might later, in a distant capital, use their skills to rise to a position of influence. A merchant might enjoy the protection of a Mongol passport while trading in goods produced by people living under that same empire's oppressive rule. This is the central lesson the Silk Road teaches us about history itself, that we must resist the temptation to see the past in simple, binary terms. By holding these competing truths in tension, the ideal of peaceful exchange and the reality of imperial power, we achieve a far richer, more honest, and more human understanding. The Silk Road wasn't a parable, It was a complex, contradictory, and utterly fascinating reality where the best and worst of humanity traveled side by side, forever shaping the world we live in today. For tens of thousands of years, two different kinds of human called Europe their home. One, our own species Homo sapiens, was a recent arrival. The other, the Neanderthals, were the original natives, a robust and clever people who had weathered ice ages and mastered the challenging landscape. Then, in what is a geological blink of an eye, they were gone. Their complete disappearance around 40,000 years ago is one of prehistory's greatest cold cases, and the question of what happened to them forces us to confront a fundamental truth about our own story. Did we meet our evolutionary cousins in peaceful coexistence, in violent conflict, or in a more intimate and lasting way that still echoes within us today? The debate over their extinction is a perfect storm of competing theories, where new scientific evidence constantly upends old certainties, proving that the most ancient chapters of our past are still being rewritten. For a long time, the most intuitive explanation was also the simplest and most brutal: we killed them. This theory of direct competition, often called replacement, paints a picture of Homo sapiens as a superior and ultimately unstoppable force. Proponents of this view point to several key advantages our ancestors may have possessed. We might have had more sophisticated language and symbolic thought, allowing for better coordination during hunts and more complex social structures. Our technology, particularly more refined and lethal projectile weapons, could have given us an edge in bringing down large game. There's also the grim possibility of germ warfare. Diseases that we carried, to which we had some immunity, might have swept through the Neanderthal population with devastating effect, a tragic and unintentional microbial invasion. In this scenario, the encounter was a zero-sum game for resources. As our populations expanded, we outcompeted them for the best hunting grounds and shelter, leading to their gradual decline and eventual extinction through a combination of conflict, pressure, and perhaps even outright genocide. This view holds that we simply were better equipped to survive, and our success came at their direct expense. But then, science introduced a plot twist that completely reshaped the narrative. The sequencing of the Neanderthal genome revealed something astonishing. For most people of non-African descent, around 1 to 2% of their DNA is Neanderthal in origin. This single discovery transformed the debate from a simple us versus them story into something far more complex and intimate. We didn't just meet Neanderthals, we connected with them. This genetic evidence is the smoking gun for the assimilation theory, which argues that Neanderthals didn't so much go extinct as they were gradually absorbed into the much larger population of incoming Homo sapiens. Think of it not as a replacement but as a merger. When small bands of these two peoples met, they interbred. Their hybrid children were raised within sapiens groups, and over generations, the distinct genetic identity of Neanderthals was diluted, like a river merging into a vast ocean. In this view, their disappearance wasn't a tragedy of violence, but one of demographics. Their population was always small and fragmented, and simply couldn't maintain a distinct genetic identity once a larger, more interconnected population arrived on the scene. A piece of them didn't vanish. It lives on in us, of course. The environment itself may have been the ultimate arbiter, a third party that tilted the scales. The period of the Neanderthals' decline was one of significant climatic instability, with sharp swings between cold and warm periods that would have dramatically altered the landscape. The vast herds of megafauna that Neanderthals relied on, creatures like woolly rhinoceros and mammoths, may have struggled or shifted their ranges. Neanderthals, with their heavier, more muscular bodies, were physiologically adapted for cold climates and required a high-calorie diet to sustain themselves. A series of harsh winters or a decline in their preferred large prey could have pushed their already small populations to the brink. Homo sapiens, perhaps more behaviorally flexible and able to exploit a wider range of resources, including fish and smaller game, might have simply been more resilient to these ecological shocks. In this scenario, neither competition nor assimilation was the primary cause. Instead, Neanderthals were the victims of bad timing, holding on through innumerable challenges only to be finished off by a changing world that played to our strengths and their weaknesses. The most compelling answer likely lies in a combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of pressures that no single theory can fully explain. It's entirely plausible that climate change stressed Neanderthal populations, making them more vulnerable. This vulnerability could have made competition with the incoming sapiens more decisive, and that contact itself likely involved both conflict and interbreeding. Perhaps some groups were outcompeted while others slowly merged through interbreeding. This multifaceted view acknowledges the incredible complexity of this prehistoric encounter. It wasn't a single event but a long, drawn-out process that unfolded differently in different valleys and across different generations. The ongoing debate, fueled by each new archaeological find and genetic analysis, shows us that the deep human past is not a settled fact but a dynamic field of inquiry. The story of the Neanderthals is ultimately our story too, a haunting reminder of our planet's ever-changing nature and the fragile, intertwined threads of existence that connect all humanity, past and present. And so we arrive at a crucial, perhaps surprising, conclusion after this long journey through the intellectual battlegrounds of history. The fierce rivalries, the passionate disagreements, the decades-long feuds between scholars, these are not signs of a broken discipline. They are the very engine of its progress. Think of it not as a chaotic free-for-all, but as the academic equivalent of the scientific method, a relentless process of peer review where every claim is stress-tested, every assumption is questioned, and no theory is ever allowed to rest comfortably for too long without someone demanding to see its evidence. This collaborative competition is what separates history from dogma. It ensures that our understanding of the past is never finalized, never set in stone, but is instead a living, breathing conversation that evolves with each new generation. This process forces a kind of intellectual humility that is essential for any true understanding. A historian working in isolation might become convinced of a single, elegant narrative, falling in love with their own theory. But when that theory is thrown into the arena of academic debate, it is met with a chorus of other experts armed with counter-evidence, alternative interpretations, and questions they hadn't considered. This isn't a hostile takeover, it's a rigorous quality control. The debate over the fall of Rome is a perfect example. If Gibbon had been the last word, we would have a simplistic story of moral decay. Because others challenged him, we now have a rich, multi-layered explanation involving economics, climate, disease, and military logistics. The conflict didn't obscure the truth. It built a much fuller, more interesting, and more useful truth. The same is true for the decipherment of scripts, where the competition between Champollion and Young, or the collaboration between Ventris and Kober, ultimately led to a breakthrough that neither might have achieved alone. The rivalry sharpens the focus and elevates the work of everyone involved. Most importantly, this constant state of reevaluation protects us from the greatest danger in the study of history: certainty. When a society decides it possesses the one true and complete story of its past, it stops thinking critically. It becomes dogmatic, using history not as a tool for understanding, but as a weapon to legitimize its present power structures and silence dissent. We've seen this with the nationalist histories of the 19th century that were crafted to justify empire. or with the efforts of totalitarian regimes to erase inconvenient chapters from their textbooks. The ongoing, messy, and often contentious debates among professional historians act as a powerful bulwark against this. They ensure that no single narrative can ever claim a permanent monopoly on the past. There will always be a graduate student somewhere or a seasoned professor in another country who finds a new piece of evidence or asks a new question that challenges the accepted wisdom. This doesn't mean we can't know anything about the past. It means that our knowledge is always provisional, always open to refinement, and that is its greatest strength. Ultimately, the legacy of these competing histories is a gift. It gives us a past that is as complex, nuanced, and fascinating as our present. It teaches us to be comfortable with ambiguity, to weigh evidence, and to understand that the people of the past were not one-dimensional characters in a simple story, but real humans with conflicting motives and limited perspectives, just like us. The discipline of history, in its best form, is not about delivering final answers. It is about teaching us how to ask better questions, and it is in the vibrant, unending clash of those questions, the collaborative competition between countless minds across the centuries, that we come closest to the endlessly elusive and endlessly compelling truth. This grand journey through the clashes and debates of historians reveals something far more profound than just a series of corrected facts. It uncovers the very nature of how we understand truth itself. The story of the past is not a single polished monument built by a lone genius. It is a sprawling, bustling, and sometimes raucous marketplace of ideas. In this arena, every claim is challenged, every source is scrutinized, and every generation brings its own questions to the evidence, ensuring that history remains a living, breathing dialogue rather than a dusty obituary. The rivalries we've explored, from the monastic scribes to the decipherers of scripts, aren't a sign of failure in the discipline. They are its lifeblood, the essential process that keeps our understanding dynamic, honest, and relentlessly moving forward. This process gifts us with a far richer and more meaningful connection to antiquity. If history were just a collection of settled facts, it would be static and sterile, a closed book offering no new insights. But because it is a conversation, it allows us to see the ancient world in all its glorious complexity. The debates over figures like Alexander the Great or the fall of Rome don't mean we know nothing. They mean we understand the multiple layers of motivation, the interplay of economic and environmental factors, and the profound humanity of people who are just as complicated and contradictory as we are. This ambiguity isn't a flaw, it's a feature. It allows us to engage with the past not as passive recipients of a finalized story, but as active participants in an ongoing investigation, bringing our own perspectives and experiences to bear on the eternal questions of power, identity, and human nature. So the next time you encounter a historical documentary, read a book about the pharaohs, or walk through the hushed halls of a museum, I urge you to listen for the echoes of those debates behind every display and every claim. See the artifacts not as definitive answers, but as pieces of evidence in the world's longest-running cold case. Remember that the narrative presented is just the current consensus, a snapshot of our best understanding at this moment, always subject to revision. Let that fill you with a sense of curiosity and excitement, not uncertainty. The greatest lesson from this entire saga is that the quest for the past is never over. The next groundbreaking discovery might be waiting in an untouched tomb, a forgotten archive, or a new way of analyzing ancient DNA. It invites all of us to stay curious, to question what we think we know, and to appreciate the passionate, collaborative competition that turns the scattered fragments of the past into the endlessly fascinating